Hey everyone, this is vandweller, and this is the first episode of Hey Van. In this series, I take your sit-and-go questions or your tricky sit-and-go hands, and I do my best to make sense of them and give you some sort of reasonable and helpful answer. A little bit about this series. This is not a typical regular DC series where there's 8 episodes for 8 consecutive weeks. This is sort of an occasional thing where if I get enough questions, I'll do one, and if I don't, I won't. So send in your questions, and I'll do as many of these as I can. And if you have a sit-and-go question that you want answered in a future episode of Hey Van, send me an email at vandweller@deucescracked.com. You could also send me a private message on Deuces Cracked, and my username there is vandweller. And be sure to include the phrase Hey Van in the subject line. Otherwise, it'll get shunted to the wrong email folder and I'll never see it. So, with all that out of the way, let's go on to the first question. The first question is, Hey Van, I was wondering if you could talk about this article. And there's a URL. And he says, I'm sure it might be a little useless for the under $10 grinders, but I at least play $20 to $100 games, and with good regs in there, I definitely think there are spots when you can use the concept in question in order to get a big stack to the bubble where you can own the regs who won't call you down light because they're playing according to ICM. And the article in question is, where is it? There it is. It's right here on this site called Sit and Go Planet. And before I plunge into the article, this article is written by Albatross77, who I don't know what he's up to now, but I know at least 2 years ago he was a regular at kind of lower mid stakes sit and goes on PokerStars, like the $16 level, and I don't know, and he was a very good winning player, and obviously if he's writing articles and he's thinking to, and he's a winner, so there's got to be something to this article, right? And also this Sit and Go Planet site is okay. There's some decent information here, but all of it, as you can tell from sort of how these articles are written, it's meant to catch the eye of search engines and get you to click on all the ads and stuff like that. So don't click on any of these ads. Click on all the ads on Deuces Cracked and get raked back from them and so forth. But go ahead and read this article. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video, give you time to read the article, and I'll come back and tell you my comments on it. So go ahead, pause your video, and I'll be right back. All right, hopefully you're back. And I went ahead and, took an image of this article so I couldn't stand looking at the ads anymore. It's just a very busy page. Plus, I wanted to highlight sort of the relevant parts here. And I'm not going to go ahead and read the article on camera here, but I'll just go over the relevant parts here. So he says, of course, it's called When to Ignore ICM, a winning turbo strategy that's outside the box. The action is 5-handed, and the blinds are 200, 400 with antes of 25. I'm in third place. I'm in the big blind with about 1,900 chips. The button immediately pushes all in for 2,300 chips, and he has both blinds covered. Small blind folds. And he says, I need to be confident that I'm far ahead of my initial raiser's pushing range, right? And he says, wrong. I have 9-8 offsuit, and I click the call button. So let's imagine for a minute that you listen to an ICM expert and fold your 9-8. Well, 2 hands later, you're down to 1,250 chips, and that same expert will be telling you to open the pot by pushing all in from the button when you're dealt 9-8. But the blinds and antes eat away at your stack so fast that you're pushing with junk before you know it. You might as well call with junk while you still have a big stack. So I call with my 9-8, and I 8 spikes on the river, and voila, I'm the chip leader. And he goes on to say, let me scroll down here. It's a tremendous advantage to have the chip lead as the bubble approaches. I bully the larger stacks at the table for the next few rounds, and I coast into a relatively easy sit-and-go victory, as if it's that easy. Next time you play a sit and go, the biggest mistakes your opponents will make are their folds near the bubble. If only that were true. You're looking to play big pots to defend your blinds and to win that crucial showdown that's going to give you the chip lead on the all-important bubble. So I don't know what that's the essence of the article. So what do you all think of that? Well, what I decided to do is to set up the situation that he describes in Sit and Go Wizard, and he says we have about 1,900 chips. I'm guessing that's behind. We have 1,900 behind with 400 in the middle and 25 in the ante. So I'm guessing we start with 2325, and I'm guessing that this guy probably starts with 2325 with 25 in the middle. So I set this up. Let me go grab that. So there's the setup in Sit and Go Wizard. Now, and this is exactly as he described: 200, 400, poker stars, antes, these stack setups. And here's the guy on the button pushing into us. Now, I gave him 45%. If you go to hold'emresources.net, I think it's hold'em-resources.net, and they have an ICM program there that will tell you sort of the unexploitable game theoretical optimal pushing ranges and so forth. And I think they came out with, what, 44.5% for the button here, so I gave him that. Right now, of course, I could give him what I think is a reasonable range, which actually this isn't a terrible range for a guy like that, although I think I might even be pushing wider than that. But be that as it may, I mean, it's not going to change the value of this too much until you get to, like, here's the thing, like if he's pushing 100%, this isn't even that bad a call, right? You know, it's really, really close. I mean, I'm going to set the edge to 0 here. But let's give him something, you know, apparently he thinks that the biggest mistakes that people make are their folds, which implies people are being over tight. So they're probably not pushing 100% in his world. They're probably, I don't know, pushing like reasonable looking hands like that. Maybe a little more, but 45% seems okay, just as a way to get the discussion going. So we have 9-8 offsuit. Now, as he says, this is clearly a negative call. Sit and Go Wizard. You know, the ICM expert says it's negative 3.3% of the prize pool to make this call, right? So he decides to click call, and we call. And was that a good thing to do? Well, he's doing so on the basis that, all right, we'll be able to eliminate this guy and end up with the big stack on the bubble, right? Which is such an advantage, he says. It's a tremendous advantage to have that chip lead on the bubble, that we can coast to a relatively easy sit and go victory. And now the way I set up the sacks here, I mean, he gave us 2,300 for this guy. He said he had the small blind covered, so I gave him a little bit less, and he said that what we had, right? So in a 9-handed sit and go, there's this many chips left to distribute, right? So I tried to distribute the chips to the other two players in such a way that we would have them both covered so that we could push them around because of the presence of this guy when we win, right? So let's take a look at what the scenario looks like. All right, so you see that, right? You see that it's negative 3.3% of the prize pool. So this call is okay if by making the call, when we win, we're able to make up this 3.3% of the prize pool relatively easily, you know, plus more, right? Relatively easily. So is that even a feasible thing to think? Well, let's take a look at the resulting scenario if we happen to win. Of course, if we lose, we're out, right? But if we win, what will it look like? All right, so here's what it looks like if we win, right? That guy's eliminated. We become the small blind because we were just in the big blind, right? And then everything changes accordingly. I gave us kind of a middling hand, kind of the average hand that we could expect to get in this scenario. Queen 7, and I mean, even if we gave us 3-2 offsuit, you know, it doesn't change the scenario hugely. So gave us Queen 7 offsuit here. What would it be if we were aces? If we're aces, obviously it would be a monster shove. But okay, so let's look at this stack scenario. Are we set up to make up that 3.3% equity in the prize pool? Well, as you can see here, the value of our shove here is that we have, you know, if it's folded to us, which we can't even guarantee that that's the case, right? But if let's just assume the best scenario that it's folded to us every time, we would have to do about 3 of these, have 3 shoves with this magnitude to make up what we lost. Now, is that feasible? Well, yeah. I mean, presumably, if it is folded to us with the presence of this short stack, we're going to be able to, take a fair number of pots away from these players. And of course, the other thing is we can survive an all-in if we get all in and we lose, and so we're not out. So, yeah, there's nothing, I guess. I mean, if you look at it in the long-term perspective, right? See, there's two ways to sort of look at ICM decisions. You can look at it in the immediate term, right? What's the raw value of this? Forgetting every other hand, just what is it in a vacuum? And then what would it be if we look at future hands and what this will result in and how this contributes to the utility of our stack in later hands? And you can look at it from that perspective. So it is definitely the case that something that looks negative can be a positive, or at least our best option, when looked at in a long-term perspective. But that's nothing that we don't know, right? We know that already because we make those, for example, those desperation shoves, right? When we're about to lose fold equity, if we go through the blinds, we shove with a trash hand under the gun or an early position in order to win the blinds and potentially preserve our fold equity so that we can then go on and use our fold equity to gain more chips later, right? So that's not a concept that we are totally unfamiliar with. It's just that this article is saying that there are times when you ought to do it when it's a call and not just a shove. And I think that Albatross has a point. But of course, there are limits to that, right? You can't just say, well, anytime I'm on the bubble, call with a trash hand, and that because then you can ghost to a relatively easy sit and go victory, as if having the chip lead on the bubble results in a sit and go victory the majority of the time, which I don't think that it does. Well, I mean the majority of not more than 50% of the time, right? So. But again, there's a limit to this concept, right? And let me bring up a scenario that might bring up the limit of this concept. So here's a scenario, right? The scenario is, all right, we've got a couple of blinds are 100, 200. We've got a couple of tiny stacks here. We've got an equal stack with this guy who decides to push all in on us like a massive overshove, right? Now, if you look, our equity right now is 32, if we fold, it's 32.87, right? And how bad of a call would this be? Let's give us 9-8 offsuit, just like that guy says. So our equity, yeah, 32.87. And how bad is our call? Our call would lose, on average, 17.92% equity in the prize pool, which is, like more than 1.5 times what you started with. So it is true, the case is true, right, that if we were to call and win, then we would coast to a relatively easy victory because we'd have this massive stack on the bubble and we'd be able to just rob everyone in blind. We could survive pretty much any all-in scenario, and we would definitely cruise, an overwhelming majority of the cases, to an easy sit-and-go victory, right? But if you look at something, now if you remember from the 8th episode of my Sit-and-Go Grinder series, where I talk about equity ceilings, the fact that your equity can never be more than the first place percentage prize in the tournament. Well, if you look at this here, our equity if we fold is 32.87, right? Our equity if we call, right, we'll be losing on average 17.92. Let's say 18% equity in the tournament. Well, if we call here with the intention of making up what we lose in future hands, well, that doesn't really make any sense in a scenario like this, right? Does it? Because the equity if we fold, plus we have to make up from where we are now what we lost on average, well, that totals more than 50%, which we can never, ever have in the tournament, right? So you see that there's a limit to this concept because of the equity ceiling, right? Now, of course, the scenario he describes is nowhere like that, right? We are, where is that? Right here, right? So we're far from the equity ceiling, relatively. And, all that stuff in the article about how he talks about, you're in third place and you have a big stack. I mean, that's not really, even possible given the scenario he described. But forgetting that, we're much further from the equity ceiling, so it can be more correct to do it now, right? So in general, the principle is the further you are from the equity ceiling, the more correct it is to take negative EV gambles in order to make up that lost EV with the utility that, you know, the resulting stack, if you win, would give you, right? And the closer you are to the equity ceiling, the more wrong it is. And in general, you know, in sit and goes, it is much. In sit and goes, it's not as great a move as it is in a multi-table tournament, where everyone starts out very far from the equity ceiling. It's much more correct. These kind of negative EV stack building moves, they're much more correct in a multi-table tournament context than they are in a sit and go. And that's because you're just so far from the equity ceiling, whereas in sit and goes, I mean, compared to a multi, you start out pretty close to the equity ceiling, right? And your job is to get there. And it happens in short order because you start so close. But in a multi-table tournament, it's really far away. So there are limits to that concept. And, you know, if you're, would I make this call? You know, I probably puss out and probably not do it. But I think it shows that it can be valid, assuming, but here's the thing that has to happen. You have to know that you're relatively far from the equity ceiling. You have to know, and see, it also depends on, you know, your opponents being tight. Like this scenario, this alternative scenario that he gives, right? He says, if, you know, your opponents are tight, you can call, have the big stack, and then, you know, rob your tight opponent's blind. Well, are they tight? You have to know that. So if you don't have that read, then you have no business doing it. If you don't know how far you are from the equity ceiling, you have no business doing it. If you don't know that the negativity EV-wise of the move can be made up by future shoves, if you don't know that it's relatively close and close enough that you can make it up later, then you have no business doing it. But if you know all those things, then I don't see why you can't work something like this into your repertoire. But just, you know, remembering all that, all those factors you have to know. So anyway, that's enough on that question. If you have any other questions on it, you can say ask in the thread. But you know, who knows? Maybe this is a new move we need to call, you know, the desperation call. You know, I mean, it's probably no worse EV-wise than several desperation shoves that people make. So, but anyway, enough on that. So here's the next question. Hey, Van, I was watching your 18-man video, and you say that you should always be tighter in an 18-man than in a 9-man. But if I just set Wizard four-handed with all equal stacks, it looks like it's telling me to call wider. What am I missing? Well, I'm glad this question came up because it gives me an opportunity to make a clarifying and correcting point. So this guy is telling me, hey, Van, you're wrong. And what does Van say? Well, Van says, you are correct. I was wrong. Not 100% wrong, but partially wrong. See, what I did when I was, you know, working on 18 mans and trying to figure out, and if you're not sure what I'm talking about, what I did is in the previous video, I showed you how you can sort of translate the changing structure as players get eliminated from it, and you can relate it to structures that you are familiar with. So this 18-man structure, when there's 4 left, and you know everyone's getting paid, and you know everyone's getting at least a 10% prize, then that sort of translates into a scenario where the payout structure is 50, 33, 17, and I noted how close that was to the 9-man scenario, which is 50, 30, 20. And I went on to say, so I mean that, you know, if you played those scenarios similarly, or at least valued your equity similarly, you wouldn't be that far off. And then I went on to say that every time that you should always be tighter in an 18-man, and that every fold in a 9-man is a fold in an 18-man, and there are additional folds. Right? So that's what I said. Is that correct? Well, no, that is not correct, as this guy points out. If we set it up just like he says, here is equal-handed, as he indicated, equal stacks, four-handed, in a normal structure, right? 50, 30, 20. And as you can see, it's giving us, you know, given his pushing range, it's giving us this range that we should call with: nines, ace queen, and ace queen suited. So if my thesis were correct, then we should have to call with a tighter range than this in the 18-man. But if we just change the structure, we can see that we can call looser, right? We can now call down to ace queen and ace jack suited. So what gives, right? Well, when I was formulating all this, I was using a scenario where there were two large stacks and two small stacks, because I wanted to sort of get a sense of when equity is at its most extreme, what does ICM say, right? So I was using scenario more like this, where, you know, here is two very large stacks and here's two very short stacks, right? And this guy shoves on us, and we can only call with pocket tens. But if you just click that and change the structure, that brings us down to, well, that makes us tighter, right? We can only call with pocket jacks, right? So in the 9-man scenario, we are now looser than the 18-man scenario, just like I said. So what gives? Well, what gives is that when I was analyzing this, I did not run like the full gamut of possible stack scenarios and, you know, just ways things could look. And then I just sort of made a, I guess in philosophy you'd call that a hasty generalization, right? That's the logical fallacy, where you come to a conclusion on too slim evidence. Right? That's sort of an inductive fallacy. So as it turns out, there are times in an 18-man when you have to be more risk averse than in a 9-man, just like I said. But there are also times when you can be less risk averse than in a 9-man. And the times, and let's see, as the stacks become more divergent, as, you know, some of the as there are shorter stacks and larger stacks, as that, you know, difference begins to widen, then you have to be tighter against a raise, right? And as the stacks become more uniform and equal with one another, then you can be to that extent looser. And then it follows that there is some time, you know, in between those two where you should have just about the same risk aversion, right? So I guess it was really a fallacy of me ignoring the complexity of sit and go of ICM, I guess, because here's the thing: your equity is here. Let's make this scenario. Copy that one. Let me type all that in. There's an 1800, 1400. What's your 12, 5000, and 90. What is it? I guess it would be 99, whatever. It's close enough. Is that what that would be? No, 10. Sorry about this. 10,900. And I guess that is, well, maybe this needs to go up. 11.5. 11.3. Sorry about that. All right, so this is the scenario, right, that we have. Now, you can see, like, all right, this is your total equity, right? Your total equity in the tournament. And that's not going to exactly match because the blinds diminish the big stack, but it's close enough. Your equity is not just a number, like a bolt from the blue from Zeus, right? It is an integration of your chance of winning first and the value of first, and your chance of winning second, the value of second, and so forth, third and fourth. And, oh, I actually have to change, oh, I did change the structure. Okay. So, as you can see, the structure here is 50, 33.33, and 16.67, which are closer, you know, which are more accurate than the 50, 33, 17. It's just, it's easier to write 50, 33, 17. Your equity is an integration of those factors, of the value of first and your chance of first, your value of second and chance of second. And as it turns out, as more of your equity is concentrated in the first and second scenario, like these guys, right? Most of their equity comes from the times when they finish first and second. Well, that means that they should be more risk averse because it's more valuable for these players to finish first and second than it is otherwise, right? There's more of their value is tied up in second, so finishing in that spot isn't really that big a hit on their equity as it's constructed. But so as you can see, like again, most of their equity is concentrated in these two spots, whereas the short stacks, their equity is concentrated in finishing in on the lower end of the scale. Whereas if you make them all equal, which I think that is what 6750. If you make them all equal, obviously, their equity is constructed uniformly, right? They get 25% of their equity. Well, that's not even true because 50% of their equity, if there's a 50% prize for winning first. But as you can see, that's how their equity is constructed. Now, if you start to, kind of give this guy a little bit of a bump, 7,500 at the other guy's expense, and you make this guy 6,000, more of this guy's equity starts to come from first, and less of this guy's start to come from first, and it starts to shift down to third, right? And if you make that even more divergent, you can take 5,000 off of him and give 8,000, and give 1,000 to him, right? That effect becomes more pronounced, right? And of course, he starts to leak equity to the other players and so forth. So, well, this guy does. So, the point of this is that ICM is complex, right? And your equity can change how it's constructed, right? Sometimes your equity will come a lot from being in first and second, and in those times, you should be more risk averse because coming in second isn't as terrible because a lot of your equity is already wrapped up in second, and going down to third would be tragic. And there are other times when you should have about the same level of risk aversion as in a 9-man, and there are times you should have less risk aversion just because of how your equity is constructed. So I appreciate the point. I appreciate the opportunity to sort of correct myself. And I know I kind of went fast on here, but you can see that the point is not these particular numbers. The point is that your equity, depending on what place you're in and how far and so forth, just as we talked about in the Flying Blinds video, how your equity changes based on what place you are. Well, that is true because of how ICM works, right? Sometimes your equity is more wrapped up in first, and sometimes it's more wrapped up in third, and that's going to change how it's constructed and therefore how risk averse you should be. So, I mean, the point is not the math. The point is to understand that your ICM equity is complex. All right. So hopefully I've made it clear that it's complex. And again, if you have more questions about that, you can ask in the thread. But suffice it to say that I guess it was a hasty generalization, but not entirely incorrect, because there are scenarios in which you should be more risk averse, and I would say, the more divergent the stacks, the more risk averse you should be, right? Just compared to the other states in the 18-man. So I don't know. I think that I'm kind of glad I made that mistake, because it's an important. It led to, I think, to a useful clarification. So anyway, I'll do one more question. And this question is, hey Van, I've heard in different videos the terms. I didn't write these. I just cut and paste them. So if they send them to me like this, that's how they go on there. I've heard in different videos the terms stop and go, limp and go, and go and go. Is there a difference between these, or are they all just different words for the same thing? No, they are not just different words for the same thing. They are all different plays that have a sort of underlying commonality, right? They have the same goal, and they have some basic commonalities that make them related, but they are implemented differently. So the goal, I wrote up a little slideshow here. The goal of these plays, right, is to add value to your hand by manufacturing post-flop fold equity, exploiting the fact that unpaired hands will miss the flop roughly 2/3 of the time, right? So what that means is Well, what do they all have in common? They all have in common that you would use these plays in scenarios when you have little to no fold equity, right? I mean, we've all run into those spots where it's folded around to you in the small blind, and you have like 2.5 blinds or whatever, and you just know the guy is calling, right? And you just know he's calling, so you have no fold equity. Or if someone raises and it's time for you to decide to go all in or fold, you say, well, I know he's calling, right? If I shove, he's calling no matter what. So you have little to no pre-flop fold equity. You aren't sure if merely shoving all in is profitable, right? You might think, well, I'm getting called so often that I just don't know if I can even shove properly, given that I know he's calling 100% of the time. So you're not quite sure. It's also, the other scenario is that you're going to be out of position, right? You're probably going to be in the small blind or the big blind against somebody who has position on you. But in this scenario, that's actually a benefit because you will have the first opportunity to bet post-flop, right? Another commonality is that your opponent's range includes several hands that will miss the flop, and therefore there are times where he'll be willing to fold on the flop. So if this is the tightest guy in the world and all he plays is, the top 5 pairs and ace-king, no matter what you do, he's probably calling on a flop, and there's very little you can do anyway. But if this is a guy whose range has a relative wideness to it, and there are hands that are in his range that will miss, then it's a good opportunity to use these plays. And another commonality is that you can manipulate your stack to pot ratio to be somewhere between roughly 2/3 and 1. And what is the stack to pot ratio? Well, it's just what it sounds like, the ratio of your stack to the pot. So if you have a pot size bet, if you have 1,000 chips in your stack and the pot is 1,000 chips, your stack to pot ratio is what? Well, it's 1, right? If you have 4,000 chips in your stack and there are 6,000 chips in the pot, then you have 4 to 6 ratio, 4,000 to 6,000, and that's 2/3, right? So basically you want to be able to make a roughly pot-sized bet. So those are the commonalities, but let's look at the individual plays, right? The stop and go is one you would use against a pre-flop raiser. And most of the time you're going to be in the big blind. And the way it works is the pre-flop raiser, he raises, you're in the big blind, you decide to call, and then a flop comes out and you decide to shove any flop that comes out, right? And of course, as I said, it depends on the fact that that 2/3 of the time, at least a range that is, well, okay, 2/3 of the time, any unpaired hand is going to, quote, miss the flop, right? Doesn't mean he won't call, but it means he won't make a pair. And of course, sometimes if a guy has a small pair, there will come overcards that will scare him off, right? So you decide to shove all in because if you had re-raised pre-flop, he would have called no matter what, right? So you can buy yourself a little extra fold equity by, instead of shoving all in, by calling and then betting the flop. If he wanted to get all in with his strong hand, it's going to happen on the flop anyway, so that part doesn't change. But with his relatively weaker hands that might still beat you or might suck out on you, you can manufacture a little bit of fold equity. And in a sit and go, there's nothing wrong with making someone go away, even if you have a slightly better hand than him. So the ideal stack sizes for the stop and go, right? Well, it's going to change depending on how big the raise is that he makes. And remember that we're talking about effective stacks, so you don't actually even have to be the short stack. You can be the big stack and have a short stack who's raising into you. Against a 2.5 big blind raise, stop and go is good at the 5 to 7 big blind scenario, because if you think about it, all right, let's say, all right, he makes a 2.5 blind raise. There's you have to call an additional 1.5 blinds, and there's 1.5 blinds that's already in the middle. So he has there's 2.5 plus your 2.5 plus basically the small blind in the middle. That's 5.5 blind pot that's going to be on the flop, right? And so that means a pot size bet is going to be 5.5. and a 2/3 pot bet is going to be 3.5 big blinds, right? So that means if you do all that out, that means if you have a 5 big blind stack and you call off 1.5 of those blinds, you'll be left with 3.5 blinds to make a bet into the into the pot, right? So again, against a 2.5 blind raise, a 5 big blind to 7 big blind stack is an ideal stack size. Against a 3 big blind raise, it's obviously going to have to be a little bit more. You're going to want to have a 6, about again, these are rough numbers. A 6 1/4 to about 8.5 big blind would be ideal. If you have 6 1/4 big blinds, you'll be making a 2/3 bet, 2/3 pot size bet. If you have 8.5, you'll be making a pot size bet. Right? And against a 4 big blind raise, 8.5 blinds to 11.5 blinds would be ideal. Now, can you do it when you have a shorter or larger stack? Yes, you can. If you have a shorter stack, it might be less effective to get him to fold because you'll be making a half pot bet, which he might be more inclined to call, even with something like ace high or bottom pair if he's if he kind of catches on to what you're doing. Whereas the pot size bet, or larger bet anyway, is going to have a bit more fold equity even against things like ace high and ratty pairs. So a lower stack is going to be less effective in terms of your post-flop fold equity. And then a higher stack, you're going to be slightly or significantly over-betting the pot on the flop, which means that you might be risking a little bit too much, right? So in this range, those are good candidates for these moves, and any less or more than that is going to run you into a little bit of trouble, but that doesn't mean you can't do it, right? So that's the stop and go, right? And write all that down. Now, the limp and go. This can also be called the limp steal, and whereas the stop and go was designed for a raised pot, the limp and go is designed for an unraised pot, right? Nobody raises. And this is usually going to be from the small blind because you're going to limp and then you're going to bet the rest of your stack on the flop. Now, you can also do this kind of move from the big blind, right? Someone limps into you from whatever position the small blind folds, and there you are in the big blind. Well, there's nothing saying that you can't go ahead, if the stack sizes are right, and go ahead and make your roughly 2/3 to half pot size all in. 2/3 to full pot size all in on the flop. Nothing saying you can't do that. It's just that you don't have to. You're not being deceptive by calling with an intention, right? Which is what all these plays are, or making a move with some intention. You're just checking in the big blind. So usually you're going to be in the small blind for the limp and go, and you can do this against if nobody limps, or if there's one limper. I wouldn't really do it against 2 limpers because the chance that 3 other players, right, the 2 limpers in this big blind, have hit the flop and are willing to call, just become too great. But it's effective against nobody who limps and you're just against the big blind, or against one other limper. It can also be an effective move. And if you're against no limpers, then the ideal stack sizes are going to be about 1.75 blinds to 2.5 blinds. So this is a micro stack move, and you can see why this might be a better alternative to merely shoving all in. If you've got 2.5 blinds and a guy's in the big blind, well, you are raising, and this is effective. This doesn't count what you already have in, right? You might start the hand with 3, then you put in your half a big blind, and so you've got 2.5 behind, right? So you can see that if you were to shove into a guy and he's got 1 big blind, and it's and he's getting basically 2-to-1 to call. He's got to call 2 blinds against the 4 that are in there against him, right? So he's getting 2-to-1, and he might call you very often. So if you're getting called, why not, when you're in that scenario, attempt to check or limp in and then shove any flop where you could make a reasonable sized bet that might scare him off if he missed, right? Whereas if you just shoved, he would call you probably, depending on the scenario, with any 2 cards. So you can definitely manufacture some fold equity. If you limp in, the flop comes queen 10-6, and he's got 7-4 offsuit, he's folding that flop, whereas he might have called pre-flop because of the pot odds, right? And if one limper is in there, obviously you're going to need to have a slightly larger stack to do this, because there's now more in the pot, and so for you to make a pot size bet or something roughly thereof, 2/3 to full pot, you're going to need to have a significantly larger stack. So one limper is going to be about 2.5 to 3.5 big blinds, and the same caveat applies as it did to the stop and go, right? You can do this with a shorter stack or a larger stack, but it's going to be problems. A shorter stack, again, you're going to have less fold equity, and a larger stack, you might have been better off getting your fold equity pre-flop, or you might be risking too much, or it's hard to say. But so that's the limp and go. Now the go and go. The go and go is something I don't do all that often in a single table tournament. It's more of a multi-table tournament move. And you would use this in a raised pot. And you can either be in the small blind or the big blind. And I'm sorry about I don't know why the tabs came out like this. It's pretty irritating, but I don't know, you can still read it. And the go and go is something you use either in the small blind or the big blind, right? And the idea is somebody raises, you make a small re-raise. You scare out, if you're in the small blind, you scare out the big blind, and you get him to maybe flat call because you think that he has a lot of his range is going to be tied up in hands that can't necessarily re-shove on you. So he raises, you make a small re-raise, he calls, and then because you have the first bet post-flop, you just shove all the rest of your chips in. All right? And this is sort of a long ball move. And the reason it's sort of a long ball move is because this is something that really is only effective when you have a roughly 15 to 20 big blind stack. And if you have a 15 to 20 big blind stack, depending on your style and what kind of tournament you're in, a lot of times you can afford to just, if you're not sure, you can just fold, right? So an example of this, right? You have 19 big blinds behind. Some opponent makes it 3 blinds from the button, and you decide to make it 7 blinds, right? A small re-raise from the big blind. He calls. The pot is 14.5 big blinds. On the flop, you bet your remaining 13 big blinds, and your opponent thinks a little bit, and he folds. Now, this move is effective when your opponent is an active player, and that's because he is pegged then to have a somewhat wide range, right? If he's active, he's not just raising with aces or kings or whatever. But you also want to it's also most effective when he's in a delicate equity situation and you have him covered, right? So if you're approaching, say in a multi-table tournament, you're approaching the bubble and you have him covered, but he's, the kind of active player that's going to go after chips, which is perfectly fine style. You can do this sort of long ball move, right? I mean, this is long ball, right? This isn't just like seeing cheap flops and taking it down. This is, you are representing a big hand by re-raising. You're shoving it all in the flop, hoping that he doesn't have anything or anything that can call. So, and the thing is too, you can, if you do this and a flop comes out that you're not entirely happy with, then you can very often check and see if he checks behind on the flop, and then you can, then shove a turn card if it comes out kind of innocuous. And, if you can check, and if he goes ahead and c-bets on a certain board, you might decide to fold because you still have, for example, in the example, you still have 13 blinds, so you're not like totally dead out of the tournament. So you can fold a flop in this scenario if it comes out really ugly. Something really just super coordinated, or rich and high cards that you he has to have hit one of them. So this is a move that I do not make I can't even remember the last time I did this in like a single table tournament, because it's just a long ball move that you don't need to be making. Now you could make it against specific player that you have a read on. If you think he's kind of a laggy player, and they do exist, good lags do exist in sit and goes. I think he's a laggy player, but he can get away from a hand, and he won't peg you for doing this. Then you can get away with it. But I wouldn't make this a regular part of your repertoire in a single table tournament unless you're very experienced and know exactly who you're doing against. But in a multi-table tournament, this can be a bread and butter play against the right opponent. So those are those three plays, right? The idea is you don't have fold. I mean, just remember, you don't have fold equity pre-flop. You have a guy who has some cards in his range that will miss the flop pretty often, and you decide to manufacture fold equity by merely, calling or by just not going all in pre-flop and going all in on the flop when you have the first bet. That's the idea behind these three plays. So I hope that clarifies it for you. So that is it for this episode of Hey Van. I hope that was useful for some of you. And if you have a question you want answered, send me an email at vandweller@deucescrack.com, and be sure to include Hey Van in the subject line. And you can also PM me your questions. And my username there is vandweller. So I appreciate your feedback if you'd care to give it. And thank you all for watching.